A global crypto giant, Binance, is now seeking an out-of-court settlement with the Nigerian government, marking a new twist in one of Africa's most closely watched fintech battles. Meanwhile, in Southern Africa, Namibia has slammed the door on Starlink, raising deeper questions about regulation, sovereignty, and who controls Africa's internet future. And in a bold expansion move, we see Moniepoint entering the Kenyan market with a 78% stake in Sumac Microfinance Bank, signaling the next phase of cross-border fintech dominance on the continent. These and more stories on tech and innovation in Africa. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tech Tides Africa podcast. My name is Karen. I'm coming to you from Kenya, and I'm joined by Kelvin. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here to do this together. Good morning, Kelvin. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Just a bit under the weather. Maybe it's the combination of the rains over the weekend here in Nigeria and some stress related challenges, but I think I'm good enough to do the podcast. So, yeah, let's get into
Yeah, it's funny that you guys have rains. I don't know if you've seen in Kenya, we're having really bad floods. They seem to have calmed down a bit, but at some point we had floods that actually ended up killing a few people,
Really?
especially in our capital city. Yes, we had about 50 deaths in one day. There were really bad floods, and the way our sewage system has been planned out in our capital city is quite bad. So there were some quite heavy rains. Apparently, I'm not sure about the facts, but based on what I've seen, is apparently we had 1 week's worth of rainfall fall in an afternoon.
Oh, wow.
So it was really bad. And I think as well that combination of rain and cold weather, I'm also a little bit under the weather, but we're gonna get into today's stories, and we're hopefully going to do a solid job on it as always. The stories keep us interested, they keep us moving. And we start in Nigeria, where Binance is seeking an out-of-court settlement with the Nigerian government over allegations of tax evasion. This story has been there for a while. We've seen a couple of very interesting stories come out of it. At some point, somebody escaped custody during this proceedings, and now they've gone to court and they've said they're trying to see if they can have a settlement outside of the court system. It's a high profile clash. It's a global platform and an African regulator, and we're seeing a lot more of this as our governments begin to be very strict with the policies and expect that international companies respect the laws that we have, which I don't think was there previously. So we're seeing a lot of clashes when it comes to the laws of the land and international companies having to follow them.
Yeah, this is a story that we had a number of discussions around last year. So it made sense to revisit this story again because there's now an update. Apparently, Binance is trying to seek settlement with the Nigerian government. I should say out of court settlement. And it's interesting because I thought they were really going to follow through with this case. I thought they had a solid case given the detention of their two executives in Nigeria for months, to the point that, like you said, one of them kind of broke out of, is it prison or capture? I'm not sure what arrangements he had, but he was under detention for months and he broke out somehow, which until today, they haven't really explained how that happened. Like, how did an executive break out of security detention? That's still not been explained. And they went on to have this case, court case. They sued the Nigerian government, and that was months ago. Now they are trying to settle out of court. I guess it has dragged for a while, so maybe they are looking to cut their losses. But like you said, it's a growing trend that we are seeing where African governments are beginning to get stricter on these global giants. A while ago, we talked about meta advertisements clash with also Nigerian regulators. So we are beginning to see more and more of these things happening. African countries are beginning to say these global giants must respect the local laws and regulations. So yeah, it's good. Sometimes you question motives. Why are they really doing this? Is this for the benefit of the citizens, or are there some other agendas at play? But I think it's a net good. So we'll see how this goes. I'm sure we'll probably visit this story one more time before we let it go whenever they do find their settlement. But at the moment, it seems Binance is trying to bring this to a close. Moving on, Namibia is shutting the door on Starlink. Starlink has passed the technical, financial, and competition requirements, but the regulator shut them down for not obtaining the ownership exemption that is required for them to operate in Namibia. Apparently, there is this rule in Namibia that requires 51% Namibian ownership. If you don't have that, then you need to get an exemption to be able to operate in the country. So Starlink apparently doesn't have either of those. And also they have like a history of illegally operating in the country. So because of that, their license request was denied. And it seems Namibia is saying no to satellite technology. I wonder, what do you think about this development?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about with the Binance issue, where international companies are now having to understand that they have to abide by the regulations that are set up by African governments. I do think that there's a precedent of them not having to, because, first of all, previously we did not have the right policies. We also perhaps had governments that were just grateful to have international presence in the country as we were trying to grow. But I do think that Africa is beginning to realize that we are the future market, we are the current market, we have the numbers. And so international companies are wanting to come in because not only do we have the numbers, we are more and more beginning to have purchasing power as a people. So that gives us even more power. So now not only do we have raw materials, we also have people in good numbers, and many of them having a certain standard of living. So we now are starting to recognize our power and our capacity to say no. But because international companies are not used to that, it might cause some friction. Now, this is a personal opinion, I have to say, but I really like the move in terms of, first of all, saying 51% needs, okay, 51% might be high. I do think that's a little bit too high. I think in most countries it's about 30%, I'm not sure. But I do believe even in Kenya, we have such a rule where part of the company has to be owned by a local. And even in Nigeria, I believe, and that's to protect the interests of the people. And obviously, we're also seeing that Starlink already has a history of not honoring the regulations of Namibia, where they had to be given a cease and desist notice that you have to stop because you're operating without a license. I think that is utter disrespect for the country and for its regulators. I'm hoping to see more and more governments stand up. I think Nigeria is doing a fantastic job of that. Now we're seeing Namibia as well standing up. I think we also saw Starlink having issues in South Africa last year, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to regulations. They seem to want to own 100% of the business, but they don't want to follow the steps and the procedures that are in those countries for them to be able to do that. And I completely think that Namibia is on the right. Their law is their law. You can follow it or you can stay out of their markets. They're a sovereign nation. They have the right to do that. And I love the fact that they're standing on their law and they're saying, nope, if this isn't done, then you need to stop operating in our country.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine for them to stand their ground. 51% is quite high though. Like you said, it's usually 30% around that. I don't think Nigeria has that rule. I think you can 100% own your company as a foreigner. But in Kenya, there's that. In South Africa, I believe the Starlink is still having some issues with getting a license there. Last time I heard about the story, maybe they have crossed that bridge now. But now in Namibia, they are also having this issue. We'll see how they develop because they are at the moment trying to get into more and more African markets. So I think it's something that we would see over and over again. Satellites internet is quite useful. It's innovative technology because of the access it brings in terms of internet connectivity. But it doesn't excuse regulatory arrogance. So Starlink should do what needs to be done to get this license.
Absolutely. It is an important technology to have, especially in a country that I believe is still trying to, as an African continent, generally, all countries are still trying to improve connectivity for all its people. Moving on and going back to Nigeria, we're seeing one of your unicorn startups has decided to cross the borders. Moniepoint has entered Kenya with a 78% stake in Sumac Microfinance. We had seen them previously try to come into the market through Kopo Kopo, but the acquisition stalled. And so they had to go back to the drawing board. And now they have taken up acquisition of a microfinance bank, one that has been there for 20 years. I believe it's a full stack financial institution with quite a number of branches in the country. And so they're able to surpass the central bank's long-standing freeze on new licenses. I think Moniepoint is making a lot of very strategic moves. East Africa, definitely Kenya is like the starting point for most companies into the East African market. I believe they think that they will be able to translate what they have done in Nigeria into Kenya. I'm not sure whether we are the same in terms of market insights and what we need, but I'm waiting to see how that plays out.
It's an interesting move from Moniepoint because it's the second acquisition they had over the last week. The first acquisition was for Order, a restaurant management platform. Then, a couple of days later, the news broke out that they acquired 78% stake in Sumac Microfinance Bank to enter Kenya. It's quite interesting because at the moment there is a freeze on new licenses in Kenya by the central bank. So since they can't enter through that route, they decided to acquire a stake in a microfinance bank. Apparently, it's a 20-year-old microfinance institution. So it gives some credibility to the move. Like you said, Kenya is the doorway into East Africa. And I knew, or at least I anticipated at some point, Money Points would try to enter Kenya. Now that that move has happened, not sure how it plays out because I mean, Moniepoint has a very solid presence here in Nigeria. They did as much as they could do in Nigeria, and they have a lot of the market share in the spaces they're operating in. So they're taking the business to Kenya, and I am very intrigued to see how this plays out for them.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that them taking up stake in an organization that is established in the country was a smart move. Regarding the freezing by CBK, we've actually seen a lot of fintechs are still waiting for their licenses. And Central Bank of Kenya kind of gave a statement a while back and said that one of the reasons they are not giving up new licenses is that there needs to be some changes to the Central Bank of Kenya Act and the Banking Act, because at the moment they have control over banks, microfinances, and mortgage institutions, but they do not have oversight of fintech. So for a long time, the fintech space has been operating under a gray area in Kenya, and it wasn't until there was an uproar because of money lending fintechs taking advantage of Kenyans. That's when we saw a Central Bank of Kenya try to come in. However, they still do not have the laws to enable them to fully take responsibility for the fintech and digital finance space. So we're seeing them try to do that. And I think that this was a smart move from Morning Point's perspective to surpass or sidetrack that freeze that we are seeing, but also to go into an institution that's fully fledged. They're able to take in deposits and lend as well. They have the infrastructure, they have quite a number of branches. And I think if you combine that with the technical know-how of Moniepoint, because Nigeria is the king of fintechs in Africa, if I were to say so myself. And so bringing in that know-how and that technical knowledge into an established framework will, I think, ensure their success in this market. So really cool move from Moniepoint.
I agree with you. Staying in Kenya, one of the stories we saw over the last week is that Kenya is moving to phase out low end phones. So they are moving to ban the entry of mobile phones that don't support USB Type C charging. This effectively takes out a lot of devices from the market because Type C is currently the new standard, the global standard that a lot of countries in the West are trying to push for. It makes sense that they are trying to catch up with global standards, but then it reduces access to the current markets that they are talking about. It's very important to make sure that these devices stay affordable. And at the moment, Type C devices are not as affordable. They're becoming more and more common, especially when you talk about low end or budget devices. They are becoming more and more present. Still, it's not there yet. So I think you kind of exclude some parts of the market, some of those new customers that will be looking to get their first devices to get on the internet and start to be part of the global market. You start to exclude them through this well-intentioned policy that Kenya seems to be moving towards.
You know, Kelvin, the first question that comes to my mind is why? What's the point? And obviously, they've talked about standardizing technology and perhaps reducing electronic waste. But is this something that the country is ready for? I honestly think this is a waste of policy. It's a waste of policymakers' time because I do not think that we as a country are ready for this. The people who are using the cheaper phones are able to access the internet at a price point that they can afford. So, what problem exactly are we solving with this policy? Is the question that comes to mind. What problem is it? You want to push people to 4G, 5G usage? Okay, how does my grandfather need that? My grandfather doesn't need 4G, 5G usage.
Yeah.
He needs to be able to call me. Right? The gentleman that works in my parents' farm doesn't need 4G, 5G usage. He just needs to get on the internet, scroll his Facebook, look at TikTok. Maybe he likes to post videos. Okay, maybe he would need 5G for that. But the larger chunk of the population in Africa is not in need of this extreme digital services, app-based ecosystems, 4G, 5G usage. Majority, and I'm not talking about more than 50% of the population doesn't need that. We have a very vibrant population, yes, that needs that. And the population that needs that is able to afford it and is already using it. So the question becomes, why do you want to take away from people who are comfortable with what they're able to afford? I would venture that if I took my phone to the village and I gave it to the gentleman who looks after my parents' farm, he probably doesn't want it. He wants something durable. He wants the harder casings because he's out in the sun all day. I don't know. It's just a question of, is this the right usage of lawmakers' time? Is this something that we even need? When it comes to electronic waste, how is that helping? Because electronic devices have to be bought either way, unless you're saying that we're going to reduce wastage by blocking out half of the users. I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand Kenyan lawmakers at this point, because we're trying to increase smartphone penetration and ensure that everyone has connectivity. And we're seeing a lot of startups coming up with products that do not even need app-based resources. They're using USSD. Now, will there come a point as an African continent where we need to move away from that and ensure that everyone is able to have app-based ecosystems? Probably, but I think we're 20, 30 years too early for that.
That's a long time.
Yeah, because I do think that at the point where 4G, 5G, and app based ecosystems are becoming completely useful is when Gen X are the grandparents, or probably baby boomers, perhaps, are the grandparents. Right now, we still have the generation before .com. I don't know. We're just not there yet. That's my opinion, and I might be wrong. I'm ready to hear from our listeners if they think that I'm just going on a tangent. But this is a law that I think we're not ready for as a country.
I agree with you. Generally, I think I would say the same thing applies in Nigeria as well. It was just a few weeks ago we're talking about Namibia where there was concern for slow adoption of 4G, and a lot of it had to do with the affordability of the devices and some of the infrastructure as well. So we talked about how they could create policies that could serve their citizens and things like that. And so that's just one country that is still trying to gain adoption for 4G devices, not to talk of 5G. And then here in Kenya, which obviously is different markets but similar in some ways, most people are really not thinking about 5G at this point. Most people just want to get a smartphone that they can use mostly to share forwarded messages on WhatsApp and look at statuses. And I think that's the most that a lot of people at the moment use smartphones for, to increase the barrier of entry for people to be able to do that. Maybe it's a bit too early, like you said.
Absolutely. Still in Kenya, and in my opinion, still on policies that make no sense. KRA is proposing to scrape off the 5 million VAT threshold. So in Kenya, as a small business owner, you're only expected to register for VAT, charge and file returns for VAT if you're able to make 5 million per year in revenue. So as long as you're under the 5 million mark, then you do not need to register for VAT and pay the taxes on that. And now they are thinking about scrapping that off, which is, I understand that their aim is to expand the tax net and perhaps the amount of taxes that they're collecting per year. My question is, what does that do to young businesses who are just starting up? We're already seeing a lot of small businesses struggling in Kenya right now. I believe it's the same in Nigeria. The economy is all over the place. We are seeing, with the wars going on and everything else that has been happening since COVID, we're seeing a lot of businesses struggling to stay afloat, and we're seeing a lot of consumers struggling to keep paying for things as they used to before. We're seeing a downsizing in expenses for most households. And so I just wonder how this is going to affect startups that are just starting out and growing, and small businesses that are struggling to stay afloat.
We also have something similar going on in Nigeria at the moment, where there's currently new tax regulation for Nigerian individuals and businesses alike. I believe the deadline for filing is tomorrow. And the new limit is that if you're not earning up to 800,000 naira per year, then you're excluded. But then there are different tiers above the 800,000. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a lot of tax regulation going on at the moment. For me, it's like, I don't know, the timing of it, it's quite strange. It almost feels like there's no thoughts to the plight of the citizens at the moment. Maybe there's a lot of pressure because of like what is going on in the global market. So there isn't enough liquidity. So they are thinking about ways to create more revenue. And of course, the citizen has to bear the brunt because this is Africa. Um, at the same time, for me, it feels a bit insensitive, the timing of these things, because everything is just sky high at the moment. Prices of things like groceries, food, it's like 3 to 5 times higher since 2023. And everything is high. Transportation is high. Groceries high. Standard of living has dropped. Most people, like you said, are downsizing to just the very basics. So the timing of this tax regulation, these tax laws is just not speaking from the citizen point of view. Maybe if I was a policymaker, I would feel differently, but from the citizen's point of view, it just feels a bit out of place. So it is what it is. African governments, on the one hand, they are tackling global giants. On the other hand, they are tackling their citizens. Like I always say, the ironies with African countries are always quite interesting.
I usually wonder, Kelvin, is there a country that ever got successful and self sufficient through taxation? Because as a country already, we're so overtaxed. I think for most of us, 40% of our income is taxes. So at what point does it stop? Do you want to take 70% of everyone's income sleep? It just doesn't make sense anymore. And the more you reduce the capacity for your people to create a good living for themselves, the more you reduce their capacity to build businesses and for the economy to be revived and alive. You kill businesses, you kill morale of your citizens, you just you are overburdening them to a point where they will break. And I think as a country, we are reaching there. I think part of the reason why we saw Mandamano last year, or was it last year but one, was because we were very closely reaching that limit. And I think they're now pushing it, and it's just too much, in my opinion. I do think that for people who are perhaps in the founder space, and you're looking for a creative way to make money, simplifying tax compliance would be having tools that can do that, or handle this VAT filings might be a good idea to go where you're serving SMEs, because most of them have no idea what it is that they're doing. So that might be a good route to go. However, I do feel that this is a law that is just wrongly timed, and I do not think it helps the country in any way. But that's a personal opinion, and I will end it at that.
I agree with you. That's actually a good shout for opportunities to build tax solutions, because most people are, especially from our generation, from generation after, are going to be interacting with a lot of this tax regulation for the first time properly, because it seems like there is now a deliberate effort to capture a huge segment of the informal markets, and bring them to the tax net. So a lot of people would actually just be interacting with a lot of these tax laws for the first time. So it's an opportunity for founders building in that space or thinking about building in that space. Other than that, as for personal opinions, I think you've heard where we lie on the subject. And that's where I'll leave it for this week's conversation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Tech Tides Africa podcast. Remember, leave a comment or share with your friends. We'll see you next Thursday at the same time and place you get your podcast. Until then, stay well.